So I just want to welcome everybody and thank you for joining the League of Women Voters of Kentucky for this webinar about primary elections in Kentucky. We'll be asking, should Kentucky keep its current closed primary elections in which only registered Republicans and Democrats can vote in their respective party's primary, or should we adopt a more open system of selecting general election candidates? We have a lot of questions and we have two distinguished panelists to answer them. We welcome your questions to submit those within the chat, I believe is active. And tonight's moderator is Liza Holland. She is a league member of the League of Women Voters of Lexington. And I'm actually going to be helping with monitoring the chat questions today. So, and we'll make sure that we might be able to answer in during the webinar, and then toward the end, we'll make sure we've gotten all the questions answered. So, I hope you find tonight's discussion interesting and helpful in forming your opinion about whether Kentucky should have an open or a closed primary system. And I will turn it over to Liza to introduce our speakers.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you so very much for joining us for this discussion. It promises to be a very interesting discussion on this topic of open primaries. And we are pleased to have two very distinguished panelists with us today to explore this topic. First, we have Trey Grayson. Trey Grayson is a partner of Frost Brown Todd, where he serves as the Lobbying and Public Policy Practice Group Leader. He served 2 terms as Kentucky's Secretary of State, also serving as president of the National Association of Secretaries of State and the chair for the Republican Secretaries of State Association. Trey continues to be recognized as a national leader in election administration and is often called upon to advise state legislatures, state and local election administrators, and businesses across the country. In addition, he regularly authors opinion pieces for publications in such outlets as The Economist, in the New York Times, and is sought out by members of the press and the League of Women Voters, obviously, for his insightful, nonpartisan understanding of election issues. And second, we have Josh Douglas. Josh Douglas is a professor of law at the University of Kentucky. He teaches and researches election law and voting rights, civil procedure, constitutional law, and judicial decision-making. He is the author of Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. His next book, yay, thank you, know what to look for on Amazon. His next book is due to be released in May, and it is called The Court versus the Voters, the troubling story of how the Supreme Court has undermined voting rights. Josh is also co-author of an election law casebook and co-editor of Election Law Stories, which tells the behind-the-scenes stories on the major cases in the field. He's a frequent contributor to media outlets such as the New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, The Atlantic, and many others. And he is also a proud member of the League of Women Voters. Thank you so much and welcome. So both of you have a wonderful history with this particular topic, and we'd like to start in alphabetical order that says advantages of open primaries. So Josh, if I can ask you what you consider from your perspective, how open primaries can enhance voter engagement and participation, and what other advantages you see to open primaries.
Sure. So first, Liza, thank you, and thanks to the League for inviting me to come speak tonight, and to the League in general for being so supportive of a lot of my work. It's always great to have the League's support and membership when I'm able to give talks and otherwise. So this is a really important topic, obviously, because too often the primary election is the only election that matters in lots of different contexts. When you have an area that is, so skewed one way or the other in terms of the partisan makeup, it's the primary that matters. And because sort of we know that the winner of the primary will win the general election in certain districts. And so I think the benefit of open primaries is that it would allow more people to participate in the election that actually matters. Now, some people will say, well, that, let's essentially non-party members decide the nominee. If you're in a very heavily Republican district and you let anyone participate, then it's no longer really a Republican primary. But at the same time, I think, again, the advantages are if you're in an area that the primary is the only game in town, well, then you have to go, you're limited as to who can participate. And then add to that Kentucky's rule that you can't change your party primary, your party registration until, you can't change it after December 31st of the year before the election. A lot of people aren't thinking about this. So they might decide, look, I actually do want to vote in the Democratic or Republican primary because there are elections in those primaries that are the ones I care about. But if you don't think about that until March or April, you're out of luck if you're already a registered voter. So I just think it does, the term is closed primary. I think it closes off participation to lots of people.
Thank you so much. Trey, what are your thoughts on what are the advantages of open primaries?
So I think Josh sort of said this, but I don't think he quite said it explicitly. I suspect that if you had an open primary system over time, you would see greater turnout. It's hard when you do like these one-off things because so much of turnout is based upon who's actually on the ballot and is it an incumbent or open seat, that kind of thing. But if you look over a certain period of time, you would assume that would increase turnout in the primary if you allow more people to participate. I mean, a good example is, in our statewide election last year, a lot of, other than I think there were a couple special elections, or maybe even some wet dry votes on the primary election day in 2023. But that meant if you were an independent or affiliated with a political group, which means you're not a Republican or Democrat, you didn't have anything to vote on, and you couldn't come in and vote at all. And so if you look at overall turnout numbers, especially as a percentage, not of Republicans or Democrats, but just as a percentage of Kentuckians, it would have been higher if those folks could have come in and picked a party primary. So I think that one, again, I think Josh sort of hinted at that, but didn't quite say it. It does allow for more folks to, kind of pick and choose and have some greater flexibility. Again, Josh kind of said that. You're going to ask about the disadvantages next, right? So we don't need to get into
Yeah,
that.
and feel free to go ahead and move into the disadvantages if you'd like, because
Yeah.
I want to give both of you an opportunity to address this advantage, disadvantage, and then I'll kind of go back and forth with different
Sure.
questions. You can cover more
Yeah.
territory.
I mean, I guess the disadvantages. I mean, I think you're weighing this objectively without looking at partisanship or something like, or inertia. This is the way we've always done it, and so you have to change it to try a different way. You probably would come down on an open. I mean, the strongest argument for a closed primary is that it's a party primary. Members of the party should be the ones who allow to vote. If you're not a member of the party, you shouldn't have a say who's going to be the party's nominee. I mean, I think that's the traditional argument. An easy counter to that is it's taxpayer funded in the primary case. And so taxpayers are paying for it. We ought to have some level of openness. There are opportunities for some shenanigans, I guess, if you have an open primary. This didn't make much of a difference, but I remember Rush Limbaugh had Operation Chaos, where he was encouraging Republicans to come in and vote in Democratic primaries to continue. I think this was the Obama. Josh, was this an Obama Clinton? And I think in 2008 when he was trying to encourage people to come in and vote to extend the primary out. And in local elections in Kentucky, a lot of our rules were in Kentucky are based upon local elections, not so much state or federal. And so some of the rules that make it like switching the party deadline, having that happen so early, closing primaries, having independent candidates file early, or at least file an intent early. All those are designed to kind of keep the local folks, voting in that primary. One thing that I know that policymakers who passed some of those bills were trying to stop was somebody jumping in the race after they found out who won or lost the primary. So like a faction could go to an independent candidate. So there's some game playing that both can occur in an open primary, but it also, these closed primaries are in effect of preemptive game playing, because you're setting the rules on the front end. But the biggest challenge I think is just inertia, and this is the way we've always done it. And so that's whether that's it becomes a winning argument just because the policymakers who are making the rules benefited from the rules because they won, and it oftentimes benefits both parties because so many places are one party rule. Democrats like the fact that they're closed in Louisville because it's just Democrats getting to vote in most of those parts of town. In my area in Boone County, it's all Republicans, and so we won't want the Democrats coming in. We just want to vote for our own. It's like that's I'm not saying we as and I agree with it, but
Yeah. Josh, let me pick up a little bit more on that shenanigans piece. Kentucky is one of very few states that has closed primaries. Are you aware of where that, that rating the open primary system has become an issue in any other states?
It really hasn't, as far as I know. It's sort of the boogeyman that people talk about when they try to make an argument in favor of closed primaries, but I don't think there's a lot of evidence of it. It would take a lot of coordination, right? It would take a lot of foresight, and it would have to happen pretty early on in the system to do it. Trey mentioned the attempt to extend the primary between Obama and Hillary Clinton in 2008. After John McCain had pretty much wrapped up the nomination on the Republican side, there was this theory among some on the right of let's try to mess things up essentially to keep the fight between Obama and Clinton go longer, to weaken them. And of course, what happened is Obama won the nomination and was a very strong candidate. So I don't think it worked. So I just think that it's one of these fears that some people have. I just think, practically speaking, it doesn't occur. The other thing I wanted to mention is that when we talk about open primaries, we have to be precise in terms of who we're talking about opening it up to, because there are different flavors of primaries. The Kentucky rule is you have to be registered in the political party. Again, either if you're a new registrant 30 days before the election or 29 days before the election, but if you're already registered and want to switch, then by December 31st of the year before the election. There's also a system called semi-closed, which is allowing members of the party and independents, those who are not registered with the party. And a lot of states have a semi-closed system, which I think has some of the benefits of open primaries. With respect to if someone truly is independent and doesn't want to register with one of the parties, they can choose that year, as long as they hit the deadline. Or no, they don't have to hit the deadline. They can choose that year as long as they're still an independent voter, registered as independent, which party's primary to vote in. You have to choose the same party for the entire year. You can't switch back and forth. That's known as a blanket primary that the Supreme Court struck down in a case in 1990. That California had a system where you could vote for the Democratic nominee primary for governor and the Republican one for Congress and the Democratic one for state treasurer or whatever. And the Supreme Court struck that down as unconstitutional. So you'd have to choose which party's primary you wanted to vote in that day. But the other thing I think is really interesting is that today, the Democratic Party, and I say the Democratic Party because they're the ones that are kind of the minority party in Kentucky, but either party could do this, but the Democratic Party would have the incentive. I think today, the Democratic Party could say, we want to open up our primary to independent voters, and the state would have to let them do it. Now, it might have to be a lawsuit because state law doesn't allow it, and the Democratic Party would have to challenge it. But there's very good Supreme Court case law that would support the party's desire to open up its primary to independents. And so I've often wondered why the Democrats have not done this. I wonder if Trey has any thoughts as to why the Democrats have not pursued this strategy, because they could increase their pie by welcoming independent voters who are registered as independent right now. So again, we're talking about open primaries, which is essentially it's open to anybody, or semi-closed, where it's just party members and independents. And those are two very different things.
So maybe since Josh asked me a question, I don't know the specific answer, but I could think of, again, it was something I said earlier that you incumbents kind of like the current system. And so it could be that some of the incumbents might not like the fact that they were opened up, that it might produce a different outcome. You know, like
Yeah.
you can see
But
a
if you're
scenario
talking about
where,
the party building, I mean, it sort of would make
yeah,
sense if you're,
mhm,
if you're talking about building the party,
right.
as a minority party with a growing number of
Oh,
people
yeah.
registering as independent. I just don't strategically. I'm not, I'm not a political operative, but I just don't strategically know why you wouldn't do that. Just like the Republicans tried to do that in
Yeah.
Connecticut.
Yeah, I think, actually, it did occur to me. One thing I do want to share. This wasn't shenanigans so much as an interesting outcome of a state that has a, I guess, semi-open primary. So Massachusetts, you can pick a political party, but if you're an independent, you can come in and say, I want to vote in this primary as a Republican or a Democrat. And I lived in Massachusetts after I left office for 3.5 years, and I actually was a registered voter up there. I contemplated registering as an independent because where I was going to live, which was the town of Belmont, was always going to be a Democratic member of Congress, a Democratic state senator, and a Democratic state rep, and I wanted to have a say by voting in the primary. I struggled with that because I was legit Republican and I wasn't legit Democrat, and I just come out from being a Republican elected official. I'm like, I don't want to become an independent. I'm not going to abandon the party. So I didn't. I picked a Republican. And what that meant was the very first time I had a race, it was an unopposed special election for state senate. And I felt like I needed to go in and vote because I was Secretary of State. I can't skip my first Massachusetts election. So I went in and voted. But then the thing that's happened was interesting is over the last couple of decades, as more and more sort of maybe centrist Republicans, kind of old school Republican, Yankee Republicans, they started making the decision that I pondered, and they actually became independents so they could vote in the party primary. That shrunk the number of Republicans to a very small amount. And there was a political impact of this in the last statewide election in Massachusetts, which was in 2022. Charlie Baker, who was the two-term governor of Massachusetts, and they don't have term limits up there, who surveys showed was the most popular governor in America at the time. He made the decision to not run for re-election. Part of why he chose not to run for re-election was that he was going to have to run in a primary with a very small electorate that was skewed very much far to the right, because those were the folks that didn't want to become independents because they couldn't envision, being an independent. And so the party got pulled to the right, and the result of that has been in the last few cycles, non-electable. There was a non-electable Republican candidate who ran against Maura Healey, who's the current governor, and then similarly in the U.S. Senate races. And so that's an interesting byproduct where, in some respects, by opening it up, it actually pulled the Republican. It hurt the Republican Party, and I could see that maybe happening. I'm not aware of that happening in other states. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it's an interesting impact. And I think those of us who support more open primaries have to think through what is the implication of that, because I think part of the rationale, there's sort of two. There's a pro voter argument, right? Like you should be able to pick, and Josh did a nice job articulating that. He's really eloquent voice on pro voter policies. But then there's also I'll call it the terminus or outcome based version of this, is that one of the arguments for open primaries that some make is that you get a different kind of candidate that emerges because independents can go in and vote, or maybe different folks who aren't the extreme or the base that comes in and votes. And the Massachusetts example, I think, undercuts that argument. It doesn't undercut the fact that I'll call it the fairness argument, but if you're kind of coming at it from an outcomes oriented argument, you have to come to grips with what has happened in Massachusetts. And that's fine. The world's not perfect and you got to overcome different arguments, but that's just an interesting tidbit that I wanted to share because I think it's relevant to the debate.
Absolutely. And I think that's very interesting. And I'd like to kind of follow up a little bit more on, as we look at Kentucky, what type of impact do you think this type of an effort, if we went to an open primary system here, what type of impact do you think that we would have on the political parties and the party dynamics here in Kentucky? Let's go with you, Josh, first.
Well, that's more of a political question, so I'm going to defer to Trey on the political ramifications of it. But what I'll say in terms of the voter impact is that I do think you would have higher voter turnout, at least in the higher salient elections. You had, just if you just look at last year, right, where you had the Republican primary was for governor was well contested, and the Democratic primary for governor was not. And, same with, say Secretary of State, where you had a couple candidates running for Secretary of State. And there may have been a couple running on the Democratic side, but there was pretty much, there wasn't really a fight for the nomination on the Democratic side. And so, I think a lot of Democrats Democrats are what, 35, 40%, or at least 35 to 40% vote Democrat in statewide races generally, besides the governor's race, of course, which was, which is an exception. But if you look at the down ballot races, I think most of the Republicans got around 55 to 60%, and most of the Democrats got around, 35 to 40%, 45. So many of those people who are registered Democrats probably didn't show up to vote in the primary, because why bother? So in terms of the voter experience, I do think that you'd more likely have higher turnout. Again, you can't look at one election, as Trey said, but in the aggregate, I do think that this would lead to higher turnout in the primaries, which again, as I said at the beginning, is often the only game in town. But I'm going to defer to Trey on the political, because he's more knowledgeable than I am.
And and I think you have to spitball on the political. I mean, there haven't been a lot of, I think if you're going to look at this, you'd have to look at the states that have made some reforms and see over a period of time. And to be honest, I haven't done that. I think in Kentucky, one of the things that we could look at is there's a little bit of a natural experiment by analogy that you can make by looking at local governments, and you compare Lexington and Louisville. Lexington has nonpartisan local government elections. So that's effectively an open primary, because anybody can go vote for the mayor, anybody can go vote for the at-large members, and anybody can vote for your own district. Louisville has partisan primaries. They don't have the at-large, but they have your district and they have the mayor. And so we could kind of look at that. What's tricky is the demographics. Lexington has got an above average education level. Education level usually is correlated, we probably can't prove causation, but it's probably not an unfair assumption that there's a causation there with higher voter turnout. Lexington has pretty high turnout. But you can look at sort of how it makes a difference in their politics and their governance, that over the years, it just tends to be a little bit less partisan. And a good example right now is you have a Republican mayor who is pretty liberal. She's always been a registered Republican, but she's never really done anything with the party. And when she first got elected, Mayor Gordon, as I recall that race, the Democrat was arguably more conservative. He was a law and order guy. And she was more liberal, especially on environmental issues. And so you had this weird dynamic where law and order supported their guy. The developers, I think, supported the Democrat. Then she pulled off some of the folks who were concerned about growth, and then also some Republicans. She's kind of a unique figure because I think she's always been a local figure and hasn't been thought of as a Republican or Democrat. And there are some debates in Louisville about the partisanship of the Metro Council and whether Lexington is a better example. And it could be that that's where we actually are seeing Republican legislators try to push a reform to not open up the primaries per se, but remove the partisanship from local government. But there is that Lexington Louisville dynamic where you can kind of look at it and see what might happen if you didn't have as much partisanship. But local races, I'll also say, are just different. It's harder to nationalize a local race. Potholes aren't, as they say, potholes aren't partisan. And so a lot more is just government operations, government performance. But everything is more national on elections anyway, even in local races. But it's, again, I keep coming back to a lot of this is the incumbents like the rules. They like to close primaries because it worked for them, and they might be afraid of an open electorate. And but if you look at different states, I'm not sure that in the grand scheme of things, it's made that much of a difference. You still have conservative Republicans winning in states that are open like Florida, and you still have, progressive Democrats winning in states that are closed like up in the Northeast.
I had one more thought with respect to this answer, or this question rather, which is I reject the premise of the question. In that, yeah, of course, in the real world, and this is just me putting on my professor idealism hat. In the real world, of course, people are going to worry about the politics of it, but should we allow that to drive what our voting policies are? I think the answer is no. And I think that if it's the right policy for a stronger democracy, it's the right policy, regardless of what the political fallout would be. Again, I recognize that people are going to want to consider the practical implications of it. But I encourage the league to reject that inquiry and simply ask, is this the right move for a stronger democracy? And whatever, however the chips fall in terms of the politics, that's how they fall.
And I'd say we live in the real world, and so you can't ignore it, and that's fine.
Given your political background, and especially with being Secretary of State, anytime we look at a change like this, cost is always a consideration. From your perspective, are there any pluses and minuses that we need to consider in considering making a move to open primaries as far as cost?
I'm not sure the cost would be meaningful. I mean, arguably, if you had higher turnout, that could actually increase costs a little bit, because you might need more people to help administer the elections on election day or in early voting. There might be a little bit more vote by mail, but I don't know that that's a meaningful increase. And that probably ought to be one, I'd like to make the argument that that's an okay increase in cost. I think one potential argument you might get from the parties is that if we moved away from the party system, like the parties' roles in elections, so it's not just that the primaries are set up for the parties, the whole election system is set up that way. The county boards of elections and the state board of elections we bake in the bipartisanship. So you have Republicans and Democrats. And then on the county board, one of the duties, both official and unofficial, of the Republican and Democratic member on the county board is to go recruit poll workers. And so one potential concern could be, if you opened up the primaries, maybe made them, quote, less partisan, would that make it easier or harder to do poll workers? Now, the flip side of that is independents can't really be poll workers in most cases, because they have to be one or the other. And if there could be other reforms, like this probably doesn't have to happen in isolation. But yeah, I think in the cost standpoint, I don't know that that's a meaningful driver of this conversation. Yeah, I don't know that it's a meaningful driver of the conversation. Correct me if I'm wrong, Josh. I'm struggling to come up with a meaningful cost differential.
So I guess the question would be whether the county clerks object, because as we know, the county clerks have a strong influence. They also have a very good lobbyist in the state. And I've learned that if you can't convince the county clerks that it's not gonna make their jobs meaningfully harder, then it's very difficult to get reforms passed. So that would be my question: is the county clerks think this is going to be more of a logistical hassle such that they would object?
Yeah, that's kind of why I'm having struggle with the cost. Because I remember a recent conversation, to be honest, I can't remember where they came down on some of these bills, but I don't remember cost being part of the conversation. I think it was more about more the philosophical open or closed.
I mean, in terms of logistics of it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's really nothing in terms of the voter registration list that really is going to be more difficult. The voting process, especially because we have, in virtually every county, the paper ballot that's fed through the machines. You
might have to print a few more ballots,
Yeah, but with higher turnout, you have to print more ballots.
Yeah, but
in terms of the voter lists, I don't think there's any, major issues.
And the reality is, as long as the data exists on who's a likely voter, I mean, this is one of the things that happens in the states that don't have party affiliation at all. And all you do is you come in and choose a primary ballot. In those states, the parties know, okay, hey, Trey Grayson, he votes in the Republican primary. So I'm a Republican candidate in the primary. I'm going to go contact Trey Grayson. And, but if somebody mixes and matches, then, maybe they get both. But and the other thing that happens in primaries is, because turnout's lower, especially in the early voting locations, you see more print on demand. I'm a poll worker now in Boone County, where I live, and I do the early voting Saturday, and we just do the ballot on demand, which minimizes the ballot. Well, we don't, they have some backup ballots, but they don't have to say, oh, well, we're not sure the turnout here, and it could be higher because the potential electorate pool is bigger, because it's either completely open or independents can come in. So we need more ballots. We just print them. And the printing technology nowadays is pretty quick. And so it doesn't create that much of a delay, because you still have the delay to check in. The time it takes to check in is about the time it takes to walk to the next table, hand them, and then they print the ballot, and it just, the line just moves.
Our study committee had a little struggle on this cost thing as well. And the one
Yeah.
point that was brought up that was that cost may be more of a barrier to entry for new candidates.
Yeah, I think for candidates, it could be higher because you could have a higher, yeah.
Right.
And primaries are tricky anyway, because you might know that turnout's going to be X percentage. And you might even be accurate about that, but you have a pool of 3 and 4s and out of 5s, you don't know which one they're going to vote in and which one they're not going to vote in. So you do have a larger universe. But yeah, I think from the candidate standpoint, it would be more expensive.
And just
Josh?
a clarifying question, and I know that you kind of touched on this, but Cindy Heine is asking, could our current voting machines be used for open primaries?
Yeah.
Would we need different machines?
Yeah, the machines our machines are, yeah, they're the same machines that are used in states that have these kinds of options. And
Any
you
other
just have to, yeah, you just program them, and it just determines the eligibility.
Josh, one of the other questions that came up was, we have a pretty entrenched two-party system as things exist today, but would there be any impact with open primaries on the selection of a third-party candidate?
I don't think so. I think that our two-party system is baked into many issues or the ways in which the Constitution has set up and our federal legislation has set up. For example, that we have single-member districts for Congress. So, our state is split up into 6 congressional districts. There have been proposals. There's a proposal in Congress called the Fair Representation Act, to have larger districts with multi-members in them, multi-members elected, and to do so through ranked choice voting. But the way that we have single-member districts, and then the other part is what's often referred to as first past the post, or plurality wins. Those two in combination kind of lead people to cluster among 2 political parties. It's very difficult for a third party to break in when you're only electing one person in a district and you're doing it based on who gets the most votes. So I don't think that opening primaries would lead to stronger viability for third parties if you still have those 2 mechanisms, at least for Congress. And of course, everything trickles down for state and local races as well. What I do think is potential, though, and we touched upon this a little bit at the beginning, but I think it's worth emphasizing, is that I do think open primaries could help moderate who comes out of the primary. At least has the potential, right? So you see in states that have closed primaries, you sometimes see kind of the extremes of both sides, extreme liberal or extreme conservative, winning those elections, because who votes in party primaries? Well, it's the diehard Republicans or diehard Democrats. And especially if independents are not able to vote, or if it's not an open primary where you could choose to vote in a particular party's primary for that day. And so you got, I think the polarization that we see, particularly in Congress, it's not the only cause, of course, but one input of that is the fact that where in the districts where the primaries are the key election, you also have a very skewed electorate that is participating. And so I think that's why you see, and I'd have to look to see, I don't remember off the top of my head what, Colorado's and New York's rules are. So maybe these aren't good examples, but, you have the Lauren Boeberts on the right and the AOCs on the left. And even if they're not in closed primary states, I think there are examples of where those districts are so heavily skewed, and those who vote in those elections are going to be much more on the polarized side, that you get the more polarized and less compromised candidates coming out of each side. It used to be that the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat were pretty darn close and even overlapping, and you just don't see that anymore. The primary system is certainly one reason among others why.
Yeah, we used to actually have in Kentucky, my congressman from Northern Kentucky for a couple terms around the turn of the century. That sounds like it's such a long time ago, but it's only 20. When I say that, I mean 25 years ago, not 125 years ago. was a guy named Ken Lucas, who's a Democrat, and he was more conservative than some of the Republicans in the U.S. Congress during the time he served. So there was that little bit of an overlap. No longer. Now there's a much bigger gap. I think to the question on the independents and the third parties, I mean, one of the things that oftentimes these open primary debates lead to, or something that's associated with these debates, are other reforms, such as 4 or 5 folks advancing to a general election, or ranked choice voting, or something like that, which then does allow it makes it easier for somebody who's not a member of one of those two parties to advance, and then they get to the ballot and in the general election. So there are things like that. There are also other barriers. The straight ticket voting option, for example, in Kentucky, makes it really easy to just color in a little box, and makes it a lot quicker to vote. And and so members, both parties benefit from that. Maybe not equally, but they both benefit from it. The partisans go do that. And so that's a barrier to independents and third parties, because you'd have to go race by race and consciously go race by race to find that extra candidate.
Absolutely. Josh, I'll start with you. Do you think, what kind of impact might open primaries have on the diversity of people who will choose to vote? Or do you think we might get some more participation from historically unrepresented folks? Or what kind of impact do you think that might have?
I think that's really hard to predict. I mean, voter turnout and who votes in general is extremely difficult to predict, and it can vary based on things like how's the weather that day. So, when you're saying to open primaries, would that lead to a stronger turnout among unrepresented groups or underrepresented groups? I think the answer is I'm not aware of any studies that show that open primaries have a difference. I don't know that it's been studied carefully. I certainly think that there are other reforms that have proven to have a bigger impact on the ability and the turnout of unrepresented groups, people of color, etc. I don't think that open primaries would have, my gut is that open primaries wouldn't have much of an impact one way or the other. But again, I'm not aware of any studies that look into that specifically.
Same. Yeah, I give the same answer.
There are a range of different types of legislation regarding open primaries. As I mentioned, all of the contiguous states around us do have some form of open primary, but it is a continuum. It goes from your Californias, where it's kind of a ranked choice where the top 2 move forward, to others that have that require you to register with a party as an independent to be able to participate. If we choose to move forward as the league to pursue open primaries, what type of a primary would you think might work in Kentucky? Open primary.
So, first off, yeah, you're right that there's lots of different kinds and flavors. California and Washington have the top 2 system, where it's sort of not it is not sort of, it is not a party primary at all in California or Washington, right? It's not ranked choice voting in those states. It's you vote for the candidate that you want, and then the top 2 move on to the general election. I think this makes a lot of sense in some places. In California, where you have districts that are pure Democratic, it's likely that 2 Democrats will move forward. That said, there's a potential. This didn't happen, but a lot of Democrats were concerned about this when there were many Democrats who were running. Let's take a district that is very liberal, and you had, say, 10 Democrats running for the seat and 2 Republicans. Well, the 10 Democrats might split the 60 or 65% of the vote that's going to vote for the Democratic candidate. And you might have the 2 Republicans actually move on to the general election, because the minority is going to consolidate around 2 candidates, where the multiple candidates, the 10 candidates, would split the Democratic vote. That didn't occur in California, but there's a lot of concerns in, I think it was maybe the 2022 cycle or 2020 cycle, there were a couple districts where it looked like that could happen. So, there's some disadvantages to the top two system. Again, I think the question is what's the best system versus what's practical for getting passed in a state like Kentucky, and those are two different things in my view. I think what Alaska is doing makes a lot of sense, and Nevada's about to do it as well, where they have a top 4 system for the primary, so that the top 4 candidates move on, and then the voters use ranked choice voting in the general among the 4. That makes a lot of sense to me as a strong democracy reform for all the reasons that we've talked about in terms of supporting voter turnout, supporting the ability to the electorate to actually give a true sense of what they agree with and believe, separate from, of course, we even talked about gerrymandering and how gerrymandered districts play into this. But I don't know that Kentucky and the legislature would be ready to pass something like a top 4 with ranked choice voting. So I think perhaps in terms of the political strategy, and Trey can talk much more eloquently about it than I can, but I think incremental changes to prove how things work would make sense. So I think the first thing is to open primaries up to registered independents. I think that's something that perhaps the legislature could be convinced to do. And then beyond there, okay, now we can move towards a more robust or broader system.
So, yeah, I was going to say, I agree with Josh on, let me take a step back. I'm pessimistic that in the short and even medium term that anything can be done in Kentucky. So I'll just start with that. And set that aside. I agree with Josh on the type of the form that I probably would push in Kentucky. I think the simpler one of independence, especially because we've seen a growth in the number of independents in Kentucky. I think it's maybe slightly above 10%, or it's around 10%. And last month, for example, the independents had, there was a lot of list maintenance last month. So both parties, both Republicans and Democrats, lost voters because of, I don't know, I can't remember whether it was people moving out of state or they got a death update or something like that. But regardless, there were negative numbers for the Democrats and Republicans, and there are actually positive numbers for independents. And especially among younger voters, we're seeing more and more younger voters. So it's actually skewed. It's even higher than 10% of younger voters. So that's probably a reform that makes some level of sense. I'm on the board of a group called Unite America. Unite America for the last several years has been advocating for reform. We like to say the primary problem in American politics is the primary problem. And it's closed primaries, a small number of people selecting a large number of our leaders. We used to be much more focused on like an Alaska type of a model that Josh described, or a top 4, top 5 with a ranked choice. And we made a strategic decision last year. We're just recognizing the reality of the landscape across the country, that what we wanted to do was while that's our ideal and that's our preferred policy outcome, what we wanted to do was to push for more states to be more open. And so if a state like Kentucky went from completely closed to just allowing independents to vote, that would be a win. And you need to have some of those take place all across the country. And then you would also say, okay, the states that are partially open, you want them to become more open and more, and it's kind of a gradual shift, and it's going to meet states where they are on the law and where they are on politics. So we'll see how that goes. One of the challenges is right now the Republican Party nationally is started to become really outspoken against ranked choice voting, in part because of what happened in Alaska, where you had the top 3 candidates were 2 Republicans and a Democrat. A Republican was actually the top vote getter. The 3rd candidate was a Republican. So when she was eliminated and you got down to the final 2, a lot of those Republicans did not put the Republican, which is Sarah Palin, as a backup choice, as a second choice. They either left it blank, or in a few cases, but most cases, they just left it blank. So they didn't put the alternative Republican, and the Democrat ended up winning. And, again, if you're looking at it from an outcome-oriented standpoint, and political parties are organized to win elections, so that's how they're looking at it. All of a, it was unfortunate from a Republican, as all of a sudden now Republicans don't like this because of that outcome. It didn't bother me because I think the system's better, and I'm not a big fan of Palin, and we should have, more Republicans should have voted for the other Republican because we probably would have won. And so you just got you have to have better candidates. But I think United America's approach is a good one to look at it in each state, where the laws are, where the politics are, and do what you can. So So, and where I began, I'm with Josh. I think a marginal letting independents vote. Another thing that some states are doing, and I don't think in this debate is it's a good policy, is to give locals the option. I think that might make some sense for like a ranked choice voting reform. But I think it'd be confusing to have open primaries for um, some and not others. County races and not statewide, or vice versa. And it just might be hard. So I think you ought to focus on let's allow independents to vote. That's probably not a high likelihood chance of prevailing, but I think it gives you something to talk about. It's also just simple. If you're an independent, you get to vote in the party primary. And you probably would also want to say it's a taxpayer funded primary. I think that's another ways using that language is to point out the fact these are taxpayer funded. And so it's okay if you want to be a member of a party, but we're going to let independents vote too in a particular political party.
That's what brought me to this topic personally, is I've been a registered independent all my life. There's just things about both parties that are crazy, and I keep feeling like if it's going to be closed, then you should pay for your own primary.
And if I could have one more thing, Liza, from an administration standpoint, because Josh mentioned the clerks, and just for those who weren't on the joke, I'm the clerk's lobbyist in Frankfurt. He didn't explicitly say that, but he implied it, and so I'm going to say it. But with the counties in Kentucky using electronic poll books, it's much easier now because you can program the poll books to when you check in and you scan the IDs, if you're an independent, to say, okay, what kind of ballot can an independent get? So it would probably have been more of a pain when the old days with the big printed rosters, because you'd have to have another roster with the independents. You'd have to mark them up. But the electronic poll books make implementing an open primary system much easier than in the paper and pen days.
Excellent. Jen, how are we doing on questions? Because I want to leave a little time for our participants to be able to ask questions if they have some.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions. I didn't want to interrupt. I know we had like a lot of great dialogue going on. So I'm just gonna like bring it back up to the top. So and I think that I think Josh talked about this, but just to reiterate, do you know of any states that allow voters to vote for different primaries for different races on the same ballot? For example, choosing among Republicans for Senate, but among Democrats for Congress, or is it always choosing a party for the whole ballot?
Yeah, that's no longer allowed based on the case called California Democratic Party versus Jones from 1990. So the Supreme Court struck down what was referred to as the blanket primary, and the Supreme Court struck that down as unconstitutional. The court basically said, look, if you're going to be a member of the party, you got to be a member of the party the entire for all races that day. You can't say I'm a Democrat now, but for the next race I'm voting on the same day I'm a Republican. That basically does not let the party choose its nominee. So you can choose, which party you're in that day, but you can't go back and forth.
We have a comment from Virginia Johnson that says that 24 states have closed primary elections and 25 states have open primaries.
Yeah, but again, we would need to dive down more deeply into that in terms of, which ones are you considering open primary, those states that have top two, which is not really a party primary, or like we talked about the Alaska system. And then in terms of the closed primaries, are we talking about, fully closed like Kentucky, or semi-closed that do allow the independents to vote as well?
Terrell Holder asks, would a fully open primary overcome the disadvantages of semi-open primaries?
So you want to take that one, or?
I'm trying to think through the differences. I mean,
so semi-open and semi-closed, I think, are the same. I don't think there's a difference between semi-open and semi-closed, right?
Yeah, it's whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, right?
it's the party members can vote plus independents. It's just, I think, as we discussed, it's sort of incremental steps toward allowing more people to participate. And and again, I think part of the conversation also has to be about the registration deadline and the deadline for changing your party registration, right? You wouldn't have, I think, as stark of a problem in Kentucky if you could change your party registration much sooner to the election, right? So
that's exactly right.
Time or 4-month lag time, I think, is a major component of the conversation.
That's exactly right, Josh, because the voter registration deadline is a way to really close the primary. the candidate, and it works a couple ways. So the candidates have to switch by the end of the year to be eligible to run. And then the voters have to switch by the end of the year. And that is all intentional. It's like, we want to close it. We want you to make the decision to be a member of a political party, absent knowing who the candidates are.
Yeah, exactly. Because the candidate deadline's not till the first week of January. So
Yeah.
you can make that decision without even knowing who's going to be running.
Yeah.
And actually, the Supreme Court has, in some contexts, said that that is an infringement on voters' rights. So I could see a lawsuit against the Kentucky registration deadline, especially because if you're a new registrant, you can choose your party 30 days before the election. It's just changing. And so, I could see actually a lawsuit. I wouldn't be super optimistic about its potential for success, but I think there's a chance that the registration deadline could be struck down under that basis.
There used to be a loophole, and something makes me think it got changed. But when I was in office, there was a way to switch your party affiliation after the first of the year. You could cancel your voter registration and say, I no longer want to be registered. So let's say you do that in January, and then in March you decide you register again, but you're now considered a new registrant, so you could take advantage of the rule that Josh described. It was legal. You can't
ask voters to do.
Yeah, but something makes me think they may have closed that loophole through a law. But it was clearly there because it was something we talked about. We didn't broadcast it, but it was definitely something that was talked about because it was more in the context of in the elections community. If somebody tried to do it, the answer was yeah, you could do it, and we didn't want to tell somebody no because the law clearly allows you to stop being a registered voter, and then you can change your mind, whenever you want.
There's a lot of great questions here, so I'm going to kind of try to summarize because this sort of these get at the same thing. But people are wanting to know what would have to happen if it's a constitutional change or a legislative change, and let's see. Yeah, and kind of how that process would happen if we were to do that.
I would say legislative I don't think you need to do a constitutional change. It would be legislative, it'd be a law. There's no, I think everybody here probably knows there's no citizens initiative in Kentucky. So it has to be the legislature themselves decide what to do. And it would be passed in any kind of law, but party primaries are not in the Constitution. And so it shouldn't require an amendment to do it.
Let's see. Karen's asking about how many other states have closed primaries like Kentucky, so just super closed. And then which states have recently switched from closed to open or semi-open? I guess to kind of, learn how that worked for them.
So, well, here's what I would say is, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but a couple of good places who compile differences in election law based upon the state that I trust. One is NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures. They do a great job of keeping track of how different states do different things in all kinds of policy areas, but they have a particularly good elections group. So that's one place to look. They're not going to advocate for open or closed. They're just going to describe the differences. So that, the link that Josh disclosed. I mean, I think NCSL is probably the best place. If you're looking for transitions and things like that, there may be some of the advocacy groups might have that kind of information online, but NCSL probably does too. But that's the go-to.
I think it's 10 states that have fully closed primaries, so Kentucky and 9 others.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And I don't know of any states that have changed recently. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any states. But sorry. There have been states that have moved to the top 2, or like we talked about Alaska, Nevada's changing to the top 4 system. But I don't know. I can't off the top of my head think of any states that have gone from fully closed to more open. Now, again, Connecticut did through a lawsuit, but that was back in 1990s, I think.
Yeah, Louisiana just tweaked its jungle primary a little bit to only have jungle primaries, I think, below statewide. Anyway, they just tweaked it, but they weren't closed either.
For those who don't know, jungle primary is basically top 2. There's another word for the top 2 system.
Yeah, the difference between Louisiana and California is, one, they do their primary on November election day.
Right.
And if you get 50%, in part because it's in November, so they have higher turnout than a typical primary, there isn't a runoff. You just win. Whereas in
Right.
California, like the U.S. Senate race, which is getting a lot of coverage right now, regardless of how much vote, let's say Adam Schiff gets, because he's the one leading in the polls, if he gets 60%, he's still got to go to a second election against whomever finishes second.
Right.
Okay, let's see. It says you mentioned incumbents like the current system. What about the general population? Do you think a lot of education would be needed for population to avoid hesitation on voting when they change to a new system, especially if you're talking about a top 2 or top 4 winner approach?
I mean, we can always use better civics education about democracy and voting rights, but I actually think this one's pretty simple. I don't think this is the sort of thing that would take a lot of education. It's like, hey, the 30% of you that are registered as independents that you can't vote in the party primaries that matter, don't you want to be able to vote in those elections? Already that's and that number is growing in terms of the number of independents, people registered as independents. So it's the
Yeah, I
largest
think,
among the three. So yeah, I actually don't think this is one that is terribly difficult in terms of an education campaign.
yeah, it's one of my hesitations with the ranked choice voting reform is it is so different and complicated, and I'm willing to be persuaded that it's too complicated to work in the real world, all across the country, and that's why it's good to have experimentation. This is the beauty of the federal system, is we can do these laboratories of democracy. But I think Josh is right. There would be a lot of earned media. I remember when Kentucky moved to the vote centers and allowing election. Actually, the biggest thing was the early voting, the 3 days. Every television station that covered Kentucky had reporters at these early voting sites saying, "Hey, it's something new," and interviewing voters. So, yeah, this is a fairly simple change. I mean, I think to me the fascinating thing would be the folks who are in a party who become, like, I think my daughters, for example. So I live in Boone County. Actually, my younger daughter still is registered in Boone. My older daughter moved to Kenton, so she's registered there. I don't know what she would do. But if you want to vote in a primary, you got to be a Republican in Boone County. And so it would be interesting to see whether my daughter, who is a legit Democrat, she didn't want to be a Republican. She's like, I can't do that. But I'd be curious, like, how many folks in that situation might find themselves becoming independents so they could vote, but then they don't have to embrace or say that I'm part of that party, other than on that day of the election, as opposed to checking the box on the card. That would be fascinating to see. And that's why it's unfortunate, as Josh said, we haven't had a lot of movement in the last few years in this space. We can't study that. But again, my Massachusetts experience tells me that over time you would see a shift because people would want to who didn't have a say would want to have a say. It's not just the independents; it's the people in the out party. When I was 18, I remember my dad telling me, "You got to register as a Democrat so you can vote in the primary for governor," because that's where it's always settled. Which is ironic that I became a Republican statewide elected official, but I was a Democrat for the first couple elections. Although, ironically, my first two votes in an election, it was 1990, and the first two people I voted for were Mitch McConnell and Jim Bunning, but I was a registered Democrat.
Well, and anecdotally, I do know of some people who, in December of 2022, December 2022, actually changed their voter registration from Democrat to Republican, specifically to vote in the gubernatorial and Secretary of State primaries. Because there was nothing going on, and I know several people who, but that takes a lot of foresight, and they who are really paying attention, who want to have that kind of influence. Most voters are not doing that.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of this reform, is you don't have to do that. You don't have to have the foresight. You could just be an independent and decide. And I think in Kentucky, I would be confident to say that there were more than 10% of Kentuckians that would like to be an independent, but they choose a political party so they can vote in the primary where they reside, whether it's a state because they can vote in the governor's primary, or whether they want to vote for their local offices, like a Democrat in Jefferson County or a Republican in Boone County.
That is a wonderful place to end here, because unfortunately we've come to the top of the hour, and I want to thank both of you so very much for this really informative and great conversation. For those of you who are participating, if you are a member of the league, we're going to be having consensus meetings at local leagues, and it's going to be happening over the next couple of months. So would really encourage you to come and participate, because the league is going to vote on whether we choose to take a stand on this issue or not. The results of the opinions that are expressed at those meetings will determine the league's position. So make sure that your voice is heard. If you are not yet a member, we invite you, male and female, to become a member of the league. And also, if you're interested in learning a little bit more, our study committee has put together a number of pieces that are going to be available on our website, LWVKY.org, and invite you to check that out. Thank you so very much for joining us.